A man stood alone in front of the law, and the law looked back at him like a loaded gun. The badge on his chest had once meant protection. Now it marked him for removal. If you're here for stories that don't sugarcoat the West, hit that subscribe button. You'll want to stay for this one. His name was Thomas Carver, and for 11 years he'd been sheriff of a town called Grey Ridge. It sat in a valley between two ridges of red stone, close enough to the railroad to matter, but far enough from anything else to be forgotten. The town had one main street, a courthouse built from limestone that stayed cool even in summer, and a jail with 4 cells that stayed empty most of the time. Carver was not the kind of man people told stories about. He didn't walk into saloons and clear them out with a look. He didn't wear his gun low or speak in riddles. He was 42 years old, medium height, with thinning hair and a face that looked tired even when he'd slept well. He kept records. He filed reports. He arrested drunks on Saturday nights and released them Sunday mornings after they sobered up and paid their fines. He settled disputes over fence lines and stray cattle by reading the survey maps and enforcing what was written down. People respected him because he was predictable. The law was the law, and Carver followed it whether it favored a rancher or a drifter. That predictability made Grey Ridge stable. Businesses opened. Families stayed. The town grew. But stability only lasts as long as the people in power want it to. The trouble started small, the way it usually does. A man named Horace Leland arrived in Grey Ridge during the spring of 1882. He came on the train with 2 assistants, a leather case full of documents, and enough money to buy the old mercantile building on the east end of town. Within a month, he'd opened a land office. He offered loans to homesteaders, bought up deeds from families who couldn't pay their taxes, and brokered deals between cattlemen and the railroad. He was clean-shaven, well-spoken, and always smiled when he shook your hand. Carver met him once, briefly, when Leland came to the courthouse to file paperwork. The man was polite. He asked about local ordinances and made notes in a small leather journal. Carver didn't think much of it. By summer, Leland owned parcels of land scattered across 3 counties. Some of those parcels had water rights. Some bordered the rail line. A few sat directly on proposed routes for a new territorial road that the governor's office had been discussing in private meetings. Carver only learned about that road when a homesteader named Ben Howell came into his office in late July. Howell was in his 50s, gaunt and sunburned, with hands that shook when he held out the notice Leland's office had delivered to his door. The notice said Howell's land was needed for a public road project. It said he'd be compensated at a fair market rate. It said he had 30 days to vacate. Howell had lived on that land for 9 years. He'd cleared it, built a house, dug a well. His wife was buried there. Carver read the notice twice. The legal language was airtight. The road project had been approved by the territorial legislature. Leland's company had been contracted to acquire the necessary parcels. Compensation was set by an assessor appointed by the governor's office. Howell's land was valued at $200. Leland had offered him $300. On paper, it was generous. Carver told Howell the notice was legal. He told him he could contest the assessment, but it would cost more in legal fees than the land was worth. Howell left without saying another word. 3 weeks later, Howell packed his belongings into a wagon and disappeared. Carver never saw him again. More notices went out. More families left. Most of them didn't come to Carver because they already knew what he'd tell them. The law was on Leland's side. But not everyone left quietly. A rancher named Colfax refused to sell a strip of land that bordered the proposed road. Leland offered him double the assessed value. Colfax turned it down. 2 days later, Colfax's irrigation ditch was dynamited. No one saw who did it. Colfax filed a complaint with Carver, but there were no witnesses, no evidence, and no suspects. Carver investigated. He questioned Leland's men. They all had alibis. He searched the site of the explosion and found fragments of dynamite casings that could have been bought from any mining supply store between Grey Ridge and the state line. The case went nowhere. Colfax sold his land the following week. Carver started paying closer attention to Leland. He reviewed every deed transfer that passed through the courthouse. He noticed patterns. Families who resisted Leland's offers often suffered accidents. Fences were cut, wells were poisoned, barns caught fire. Nothing could be proven, but the timing was always the same. Carver brought his concerns to the town council. The council met once a month in the courthouse. It was made up of 5 men: the mayor, 2 businessmen, a banker, and a retired judge. All of them listened politely while Carver explained his suspicions. The mayor, a man named Dalton who owned the largest dry goods store in town, said that Leland had brought jobs and investment to Grey Ridge. He said growth required difficult decisions. He said Carver's job was to enforce the law, not question it. The retired judge, a white-haired man named Kern, agreed. He said the road project was lawful. He said Leland's acquisitions were lawful. He said if Carver had evidence of a crime, he should present it. Otherwise, he was wasting everyone's time. Carver left that meeting knowing he was alone. In September, a drifter named Judd was arrested for theft. He'd been caught stealing tools from a blacksmith shop. Carver locked him in one of the cells and waited for the circuit judge to arrive. Judd didn't deny the theft. He said he needed the tools to find work. He said Leland's men had run him off a campsite near the river where he'd been staying for weeks. Carver asked why Leland's men had done that. Judd said they were clearing squatters from land Leland had just purchased. He said there were 12 men living in camps along that stretch of river, and all of them had been forced out. Carver rode out to the river the next day. He found the camps. They were abandoned, but the signs were clear. Tents had been slashed. Bedrolls had been thrown into the water. Belongings were scattered across the mud. He rode to Leland's office and asked about it. Leland was calm. He said the land was his. He said the squatters were trespassing. He said he'd hired men to remove them because the sheriff hadn't done it himself. Carver told him trespassing wasn't a crime that allowed destruction of property. Leland smiled and said the squatters had been warned. He said they'd chosen to leave their belongings behind. Carver walked out without another word. Judd was convicted of theft and sentenced to 60 days. Carver kept him in the jail because there was nowhere else to send him. On the 40th day of his sentence, Leland came to the jail with a document. It was a work contract. Leland said he was offering Judd a job on one of his land crews. All Judd had to do was sign. Carver read the contract. It was for 6 months of labor at a wage of $10 a month. Judd would be housed and fed by the company. He would not be allowed to leave until the contract was fulfilled. If he left early, he'd owe Leland the cost of his housing and food, plus penalties. Carver told Leland the contract was unenforceable. Leland said the territorial courts had upheld similar agreements 12 times. He said Judd could refuse, but then he'd serve the rest of his sentence and leave with nothing. Judd signed. Carver stood outside the jail and watched Leland's wagon roll away with Judd sitting in the back. He felt something shift inside him, not anger, something colder. The territorial road was completed in October. It ran through parcels Leland had acquired, bypassing land owned by families who'd refused to sell. Those families found themselves cut off from the rail line and the main routes to market. Their land lost value. Within months, most of them sold to Leland at a loss. The mayor praised the road at a town meeting. He said it would bring commerce and prosperity. He said Leland was a visionary. Carver attended the meeting but didn't speak. In November, a woman named Sarah Tremaine came to his office. She was a widow in her 30s who ran a boarding house on the south side of town. She said one of Leland's assistants had come to her property with a deed. The deed said Leland now owned the land her boarding house sat on. She said the deed was impossible. Her late husband had purchased the land outright 15 years ago. She had the original deed in a lockbox. Carver examined both deeds. Leland's was dated 3 months earlier. It claimed the land had been sold to him by the Territorial Land Office due to unpaid taxes. Sarah's deed showed no record of unpaid taxes. Carver checked the county tax ledger. Her payments were current. He went to the land office in the courthouse and asked the clerk to explain. The clerk, a nervous man named Pitts, said the tax records had been updated recently. He said there'd been an audit by the Territorial Assessor's Office. He said discrepancies had been found in several accounts, including Sarah Tremaine's. Carver asked to see the audit report. Pitts said it was filed with the Territorial Office. He said Carver would need to request it through official channels. Carver rode to the Territorial capital. It took 2 days. He went to the assessor's office and asked for the audit report. The clerk there said the report was sealed. He said only the governor or a territorial judge could authorize its release. Carver returned to Grey Ridge with nothing. Sarah Tremaine was evicted 3 weeks later. Carver began keeping his own records. He documented every land transfer, every eviction, every incident that seemed connected to Leland. He wrote everything down in a ledger he kept locked in his desk. He didn't know what he was going to do with it, but he needed to see the pattern laid out in ink. The pattern was clear. Leland wasn't breaking the law. He was using it. In December, the governor appointed a new territorial judge. His name was Harlan Stone. He arrived in Grey Ridge with an entourage and took up residence in the town's only hotel. Stone was 50 years old, broad-shouldered, with a gray beard and a voice that filled a courtroom. He'd been a prosecutor before his appointment. He had a reputation for being tough on crime and friendly to business. His first official act was to hold a hearing on a petition filed by Leland's company. The petition requested the establishment of a new county ordinance that would allow private companies to claim abandoned property within town limits if the owner couldn't be located within 90 days. Carver attended the hearing. He stood at the back of the courtroom and listened as Leland's lawyer argued that the ordinance would encourage development and reduce blight. He said abandoned properties attracted vagrants and criminals. He said Grey Ridge needed stronger tools to manage growth. No one opposed the petition. Judge Stone approved it. The ordinance went into effect immediately. 2 weeks later, Carver arrested one of Leland's foremen for assault. The man had beaten a drifter outside a saloon. There were 3 witnesses. The drifter had a broken jaw and cracked ribs. Carver locked the foreman in a cell. Leland came to the jail an hour later. He said the foreman had been defending himself. He said the drifter had pulled a knife. Carver asked where the knife was. Leland said the drifter must have dropped it in the street. Carver searched the street. There was no knife. He charged the foreman with assault and held him for trial. Judge Stone scheduled the trial for the following week. On the day of the trial, the drifter didn't appear. Carver sent a deputy to find him. The deputy returned and said the drifter had left town. Stone dismissed the case. The foreman walked free. Carver knew what had happened. Someone had paid the drifter to disappear. He couldn't prove it, but he didn't need proof to know. He started carrying his ledger with him. He didn't trust leaving it in his office anymore. In January, the mayor called a special meeting of the town council. Carver wasn't invited, but he heard about it from the clerk. The council was discussing a proposal to restructure the sheriff's office. The proposal suggested the sheriff should be appointed by the council rather than elected. It suggested the position should be reviewed annually. Carver had been elected sheriff 3 times. His current term didn't end until 1884. He went to the mayor and asked what was happening. Dalton said the council was exploring options. He said the town was changing, and the law enforcement structure needed to change with it. He said Carver had nothing to worry about as long as he continued doing his job. Carver asked what that meant. Dalton said it meant enforcing the law, not making it. In February, Leland filed a complaint against Carver. The complaint accused him of harassment. It cited multiple instances where Carver had questioned Leland's employees, searched his properties, and interfered with lawful business operations. Leland requested a formal investigation. Judge Stone ordered the investigation. He appointed a territorial marshal named Cobb to conduct it. Cobb arrived in Grey Ridge and spent a week interviewing witnesses. Most of them were Leland's men. A few were townspeople who'd benefited from Leland's investments. Carver was questioned last. Cobb asked him why he'd been focusing so much attention on Leland. Carver explained his concerns. He showed Cobb his ledger. Cobb looked through it and handed it back. He said suspicion wasn't evidence. He said Carver's behavior could be interpreted as bias. Cobb filed his report with Judge Stone. The report concluded that Carver had acted improperly. It recommended he be formally reprimanded and placed under review. Stone accepted the recommendation. Carver received the reprimand in writing. It said he was prohibited from investigating Leland or his associates without probable cause. It said any future complaints would result in suspension. Carver stopped sleeping well. He lay awake at night thinking about Howell, about Sarah Tremaine, about the drifter with the broken jaw. He thought about Judd signing that contract. He thought about the families who'd been pushed off their land. He thought about the law he'd spent 11 years enforcing. In March, a fire broke out in the boarding house Sarah Tremaine had been evicted from. The building was empty at the time. No one was hurt, but the structure burned to the ground. Leland's company owned the property. They cleared the lot and sold it to a developer from the capital who planned to build a hotel. Carver investigated the fire. He found evidence of accelerant. He questioned the developer's crew. One of them, a young man who looked nervous, said he'd seen someone near the building the night before the fire. Carver asked for a description. The man said it was too dark to see clearly. Carver pressed him. The man clammed up. Carver knew he'd been warned. He wrote up a report and submitted it to Judge Stone. Stone read it and told Carver there wasn't enough evidence to pursue charges. He said Carver should focus on crimes he could solve. In April, Carver received a summons. He was ordered to appear before Judge Stone on charges of insubordination and dereliction of duty. The charges stemmed from his continued investigation into the boarding house fire despite Stone's directive to drop the case. The hearing was held in the courthouse. Leland was there. So was the mayor. So were most of the town council. Stone asked Carver why he'd disobeyed a direct order. Carver said he hadn't. He said he'd filed a report, which was his job. Stone said filing a report on a case he'd been told to close was insubordination. Carver said he was following the law. Stone said he was following his own interpretation of it. Stone ruled against Carver. He suspended him for 30 days without pay. He said if Carver committed another infraction, he'd be removed from office permanently. Carver spent those 30 days at home. He didn't leave except to buy supplies. People in town avoided him. Some crossed the street when they saw him coming. A few nodded but didn't stop to talk. He spent the time going through his ledger. He added notes. He cross-referenced dates and names. He built a timeline that showed how Leland had systematically acquired land, manipulated ordinances, and used the legal system to push people out. On the 29th day of his suspension, he made a decision. Carver returned to duty on the 1st of May. He put his badge back on and walked into his office. His deputy, a young man named Ellis, looked relieved to see him. Ellis said things had been quiet. He said Leland's men had been keeping to themselves. Carver nodded. He sat down at his desk and opened his ledger. He read through it one more time. Then he closed it and locked it in the drawer. He told Ellis he needed to ride out to the old Howell property. Ellis asked why. Carver said he wanted to check on something. The Howell property had been sold to Leland months ago. It sat empty. The house was boarded up. The well had been filled in. Carver walked the property for an hour. He didn't find anything. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He rode back to town as the sun was setting. The next day, Leland filed another complaint. This time he accused Carver of trespassing. He said Carver had entered his property without permission or a warrant. He said it was another example of harassment. Stone issued a summons. Carver was ordered to appear the following morning. Carver didn't go. Instead, he rode to the territorial capital. He brought his ledger. He went to the governor's office and asked to speak with someone about corruption in Grey Ridge. The clerk at the desk said the governor was unavailable. Carver said he'd wait. He waited for 6 hours. The clerk finally told him the governor wouldn't see him. Carver asked why. The clerk said the governor's office didn't handle local disputes. Carver left the ledger on the desk. He told the clerk to give it to someone who cared. When Carver returned to Grey Ridge, there were 2 marshals waiting at his office. They had a warrant for his arrest. The warrant was signed by Judge Stone. It charged Carver with contempt of court for failing to appear at his hearing. Carver didn't resist. He handed over his badge and his gun. The marshals locked him in one of his own cells. Ellis stood outside looking like he wanted to say something. Carver told him to go home. Carver spent 3 days in that cell. On the 3rd day, Judge Stone came to see him. Stone told him the town council had voted to remove him from office. He said a new sheriff would be appointed by the end of the week. He said Carver would be released once he paid a fine for contempt. Carver asked how much. Stone said $200. Carver didn't have $200. Stone left. Carver sat on the bunk and stared at the wall. On the 4th day, a lawyer arrived. His name was Garrett. He was young, probably not even 30, with round spectacles and ink stains on his fingers. He said he'd been hired to represent Carver. Carver asked by who. Garrett said a group of citizens who wanted to remain anonymous. Garrett reviewed the charges. He said the contempt ruling could be overturned if Carver agreed to stop investigating Leland. Carver said no. Garrett said then he'd likely remain in jail until someone paid the fine. Carver asked about his ledger. Garrett said the governor's office had received it. He said it was under review. Carver didn't believe him. On the 7th day, the fine was paid. Carver didn't know who paid it. The marshals released him and told him to leave town. Carver asked where he was supposed to go. They didn't answer. He walked out of the jail and stood on the street. The sun was bright. People walked past him without looking. He went to his office. A new name was painted on the door. The new sheriff was one of Leland's men. Carver turned and walked away. He left Grey Ridge that afternoon. He took his horse and what little he owned. He rode south toward the state line without a plan. 3 weeks later, he heard the news. The governor's office had opened an investigation into land acquisitions in Grey Ridge. The investigation had been prompted by an anonymous ledger that detailed irregularities in deed transfers and tax assessments. Leland was arrested. So was Judge Stone. So were 2 members of the town council. The trials took months. Leland was convicted of fraud and conspiracy. Stone was disbarred. The council members were fined and removed from office. The families who'd been forced off their land were offered compensation. Some accepted. Some didn't. Carver never went back to Grey Ridge. He found work as a deputy in a town 2 territories away. He wore a badge again, but it didn't feel the same. He heard later that the new sheriff in Grey Ridge was a man named Porter. People said Porter was fair. People said the town was recovering. Carver didn't know if that was true. He didn't care much either way. He'd followed the law. The law had turned on him. In the end, it had worked the way it was supposed to, but not because of him. It had worked because someone in a distant office had decided it was worth protecting. Carver had learned something in those months. The law doesn't bend toward justice on its own. It bends toward whoever has the power to shape it. Following it costs nothing when it's on your side. It costs everything when it's not. He carried that knowledge with him. It made him careful. It made him quiet. It made him the kind of man people didn't tell stories about. And that was fine with him.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.